the horrific final days of Anne Henriette. The young princess ravaged by smallpox and bloodletting, a rotting, pus-oozing mass of flesh hastily shoved into a sealed lead coffin. This was once the most radiant beauty of Versailles. The brutal medical blades of the 18th century proved far more destructive to her delicate biology than the microscopic pathogen itself. Born in 1727 within the opulent confines of the Palace of Versailles, Anne Henriette entered the world alongside her twin sister Louise Elizabeth as the most prized jewels of King Louis XV and Queen Marie Leschinska. While many royal daughters were routinely dispatched to the Abbey of Fontevraud to be raised away from the court to save the treasury's resources, Henriette was kept firmly at Versailles. She grew up swathed in silk and absolute favor, becoming the undisputed eternal symbol of the French elite. Known as Madame Seconde, she possessed an unblemished complexion, a haughty yet captivating demeanor, and a genuine musical genius. She fiercely desired a life of refined elegance, completely immersed in the arts and the suffocating affection of her family. She firmly rejected political marriages, choosing instead to remain the perpetual maiden reigning over the courtly social scene. The king adored her so entirely that he could not bear the political necessity of sending her away to a foreign court. Yet hidden beneath the heavy layers of white lead makeup and the overpowering musk perfumes of 18th century Versailles lay a perfect biological incubator. The magnificent palace was, in stark reality, a colossal breeding ground for disease. It possessed a notoriously poor sanitation system where invisible threats lingered in the folds of heavy velvet curtains and the stagnant air of overcrowded corridors. More importantly, the medical establishment of this era was governed entirely by humoral theory, an obsolete dogma inherited from Galen and Hippocrates. The royal physicians, direct ID, theological descendants of men like Guy Crescent Fagan, possessed a fanatical belief that the human body operated strictly on a balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any ailment, even a targeted assault by an enveloped virus, was immediately blamed on an excess of corrupted blood boiling within the veins and causing a fever. When the harsh winter of February 1752 arrived, Henriette began to experience sudden violent shivers traveling down her spine, accompanied by a soaring core temperature and an excruciating ache in her lower back. Initially, the royal court did not panic. Mild fevers were a common, almost expected occurrence in the drafty palace. But mere days later, the first angry red macules erupted across her skin. This was no ordinary discrete strain of smallpox, where the pustules remained separate, allowing for a decent survival rate. The pathogen, multiplying exponentially within her bloodstream, was variola major, specifically presenting as the catastrophic confluent smallpox. The dense red papules multiplied relentlessly across her delicate face, leaving not a single millimeter of healthy tissue untouched. They immediately enforced the standard, lethal protocol of the era, aggressive phlebotomy. While the young woman's body was desperately fighting the viral invasion, burning through massive amounts of energy and losing critical hydration to the raging fever, the doctors pinned her down. They took a cold, unsterilized lancet and deliberately sliced into her veins, draining away her most vital life force. The court watched in blind faith, entirely convinced that the princess was receiving the most elite medical care available in Europe. In reality, these unsterilized incisions provided a direct pathway for secondary bacterial infections, compounding the horror of the blisters that were now rapidly swelling, tearing open and seeping thick yellow pus. From the very second the blade cut into her flesh, the flowing blood sealed Henriette's fate. She was stripped of her status as a revered beauty and immediately became the prime victim of a barbaric intersection between natural biological devastation and supreme human ignorance. A chilling visceral contrast took over Henriette's bedchamber. On one side remained the lingering memory of the radiant Versailles goddess. On the other, the stark, unforgiving reality of extreme body horror unfolding minute by minute. By the 8th day of the infection, the true, ghastly nature of confluent smallpox revealed itself. Unlike milder vesicular diseases that eventually form neat scabs, the pustules on Henriette's face and arms swelled to a maximum unsustainable tension. Then, the thin cellular walls separating them completely collapsed. Tens of thousands of individual blisters merged, fusing into a single massive sheet of suppuration. The epidermis covering her face entirely detached from the dermis beneath, sliding off like a wet, ruined garment. Blood began to hemorrhage into the dermal layers, creating hideous, dark purple patches of necrotic tissue known as purpura. The face that had once been the ultimate pride of the Bourbon dynasty mutated into a swollen, rotting mask of raw flesh. Her eyes were forced shut by the heavy fluid-filled tissues accumulating around her orbits, plunging her into a cruel temporary blindness. She lay trapped in absolute darkness, acutely feeling her own skin peeling away. The unmistakable foul stench of necrotizing tissue began to saturate the room. It was an odor so thick and putrid that not even the most concentrated, expensive rose waters of France could mask it. The most loyal servants and hardened attendants instinctively stepped backwards, gagging in pure terror and physiological disgust. At the exact moment Henriette's severely dehydrated body desperately required immense fluid resuscitation, her blood pressure plummeting as plasma constantly leaked from the massive open dermal wounds, the royal pH, physicians decided to escalate their aggressive treatment. Ignoring the weak, ragged groans and the violent, feverish shivering of the 24-year-old woman, they brought their bleeding instruments directly to her bedside. There was no anesthesia, no sterile field, no mercy. The sharp blade of the fleam sliced open the veins in her arms and feet repeatedly. This ruthless medical exploitation was executed with the ironclad belief that the fever would only break once all the black, toxic blood had been forcefully expelled. Every precious drop of blood extracted was a fatal blow to her collapsing circulatory system. Henriette was bled until she fell into a deep, unresponsive syncope. This relentless extraction crossed the line from standard medical practice into legal academic torture, fully endorsed by the Crown and the highest medical authorities of the time. The acute blood loss, combined with the continuous massive leakage of plasma from her skin, pushed the victim directly into absolute hypovolemic shock. The sterile blades of the physicians successfully completed the destruction that the variola virus had only just begun, entirely draining the life force from a body that was already actively decomposing while still nominally alive. The rhythm of life within the stifling chamber was now measured only by the sound of wet, labored breathing and the steady, sickening drip of bodily fluids soaking into the heavy linen sheets. Henriette's flesh was completely compromised, forming a continuous ulcerated surface that secreted a mixture of thick pus and dark, uncoagulated blood from the fresh phlebotomy wounds. All boundaries of human dignity were violently erased. The physician stood at a critical juncture: immediately halt the bloodletting to attempt crude hydration, continue the aggressive venous depletion, or simply step back and allow the dying woman a moment of peace. Driven by lethal academic arrogance, they chose to continue the bleeding, firmly believing, they had not yet removed enough corrupted matter to lower her core temperature. The final incision was made, severing whatever fragile thread of survival remained. Meanwhile, standing just outside the heavy oak doors of the bedchamber was a man who possessed the absolute power to dictate the fate of the continent, yet found himself entirely impotent against the laws of biology. King Louis XV peered through the narrow gap in the doorway, witnessing the daughter he worshipped reduced to a writhing, unrecognizable entity, drowning in a pool of her own infected fluids. The desperate love of a father urged him to rush forward and embrace her, but the sheer paralyzing terror of the microscopic pathogen and the overpowering, suffocating stench of active decay rooted him to the spot. The absolute monarch of France simply did not possess the courage to step forward and kiss his daughter goodbye. It was a moment where ultimate political power exposed its own absolute cowardice, leaving Henriette to face the terrifying abyss of physical dissolution entirely alone in February 1752. On the surface of official historical records, Princess Anne Henriette is listed merely as another unfortunate casualty among the millions who succumbed to smallpox in the 18th century. However, a ruthless dissection of her medical history reveals a deeply ironic and horrifying truth. The variola virus was merely the biological trigger for Henrietta's death, while the true engine of her demise remained a medically sanctioned execution. The fatal combination of extensive epidermal necrosis and the relentless torture of continuous bloodletting triggered a total catastrophic failure of her immune and circulatory systems. She died from profound hypovolemic shock and secondary sepsis, directly facilitated by the unsterilized lacerations inflicted upon her. The most dazzling beauty of Versailles perished in the ultimate state of physical degradation. The woman who had once bathed in the finest musk, K and rose extracts now lay motionless, literally melting into a gelatinous pool of infected sludge, emitting a stench of putrefaction so powerful it commanded the room even as her heart stopped beating. The cellular structure of her body was so fundamentally compromised that she began to liquefy on her silken bed. The brutal efficiency of the disease, amplified by medical incompetence, eradicated any possibility of a dignified royal passing. The court did not dare hold a public viewing or an open casket lying in state. Masked attendants, holding their breath against the toxic air, hastily shoved her highly infectious, decomposing remains into a heavy lead coffin. They frantically soldered every seam shut, desperately trying to contain the miasma of death that threatened to poison the entire palace. The traumatized court hastily discarded her as a highly dangerous container of biological waste, violently stripping away her lifelong identity as a revered princess. The sealed lead coffin of Anne Henriette was lowered into the royal crypt beneath the Basilica of Saint-Denis, carrying with it the heavy toll of medical ignorance and profound personal tragedy. Above ground, the court of Versailles immediately deployed heavy perfumes and relentless festivities to scrub the oppressive gloom from the air, acting as if the horrific physical destruction of their brightest star had never occurred. Yet history possesses a ruthless mechanism for punishing splendor built upon a foundation of rot. More than 40 years after Henriette drew her final agonizing breath in a pool of suppuration, the French Revolution erupted with unstoppable fury. In 1793, acting on the direct orders of the National Convention to permanently obliterate every physical symbol of the feudal regime, a massive, furious mob armed with sledgehammers, pickaxes, and crowbars descended upon the crypts of Saint-Denis. They smashed through the thick granite vaults and violently pried open the soldered seams of the lead coffins. The remains of the once glorious princess, hidden away in terror decades prior, were dragged violently into the unforgiving light, serving as a grim plaything for the mob's vengeance. The brittle bones that had once commanded the strings of a viola with unmatched grace were systematically shattered. What was left of her skeleton was then unceremoniously hurled into a massive communal pit, filled to the brim with boiling, highly reactive quicklime. The harsh, aggressive chemical reaction finished the job that the smallpox and the physicians had started, rapidly dissolving the calcium and erasing the last physical traces of Anne Henriette de France from the surface of the earth. This was the ultimate act of damnatio memoriae, the complete obliteration of memory. The grand, sprawling game of the Bourbon dynasty was always a dazzling shell, covering a core of inevitable decay, and the variola virus simply accelerated the revelation by turning the most exalted princess into the ultimate victim of both biology and political rage. The liquefying death of Anne Henriette stands not merely as a dark footnote in the annals of medical history. It serves as a piercing, timeless indictment of the cruelty born from intellectual arrogance. Confluent smallpox proved with devastating clarity that when facing the genetic programming of a virus, the blue blood of royalty and the dirt-stained blood of the peasantry hold the exact same value. The bleeding blades of the 18th century physicians remain the starkest evidence that medicine, when disconnected from empirical science, functions flawlessly as a legalized apparatus of torture, shoving patients directly into the abyss rather than pulling them away from it. The extreme fragility of human beauty has rarely been demonstrated with such violent precision. The terrifyingly short distance between flawless porcelain skin and a rotting necrotic mask is measured only by a few rapid cycles of viral replication. For modern humanity, the absolute horror of variola major is now confined strictly to the sterile freezers of high-security laboratories. Ever since Edward Jenner established the principles of vaccination in 1796, arriving just a few tragic decades too late to save Henriette, modern empirical science systematically hunted down and eradicated this microscopic monster, shielding billions from the humiliating putrid deaths that once ravaged the elite and the impoverished alike. Yet the deep shadows of disease and history over the French court were far from lifted. While Anne Henriette was crushed by smallpox during the hollow prosperity of Louis XV, her liquefying ghost would soon welcome another prominent member of the French royal family to a similarly gruesome biological destruction. This upcoming facial disfigurement and rapid, fearful death in the dark would signal a much more catastrophic collapse, proving her tragedy was merely the terrifying prologue. The man who had stood paralyzed outside the heavy oak doors of Princess Anne Henriette's bedchamber in 1752, suffocated by the stench of his daughter's dissolving flesh, and too cowardly to offer a final embrace, believed his crown afforded him an impenetrable biological shield. King Louis XV of France, the absolute monarch whose mere whisper could alter the borders of nations, and dictate the lives of millions, spent the next 2 decades desperately attempting to outrun the microscopic phantom that had violently reclaimed his favorite child. He buried his terror in the frantic pursuit of pleasure, surrounding himself with a relentless carousel of mistresses, most notably Madame de Pompadour and later Madame du Barry, transforming the Palace of Versailles into a blinding fortress of distraction. He banned the mention of death in his presence. He ordered hearses to be diverted from his line of sight when he rode out hunting. He constructed the Petit Trianon as an intimate sanctuary where the grim realities of mortality and the rotting stench of the outside world were strictly forbidden. The king convinced himself that the divine right to rule granted him an exemption from the grotesque physical humiliations that plagued ordinary men. But the variola major virus does not recognize the divine right of kings. It possesses no respect for velvet canopies, gilded mirrors, or the frantic decrees of a sovereign. It only recognizes host cells. And 22 years after it tore through the porcelain skin of Princess Henriette, the virus returned to Versailles to execute the ultimate act of historical symmetry, targeting the very man who had so pathetically fled from its presence. In the late spring of April 1774, the biological clock of the Bourbon dynasty began its final fatal countdown. The 64-year-old king was residing at the Petit Trianon with Madame du Barry when he felt the first unmistakable tremors of a profound systemic collapse. Instead of a dramatic collapse, the fatal sequence began with a creeping, bone-deep lethargy and a sudden, violent shivering fit that rattled his aging frame. The initial diagnosis provided by his elite entourage of physicians was dangerously dismissive. They attributed his sudden weakness to a mere chill caught during a hunting expedition, a temporary imbalance of his bodily humors brought on by the changing season. They immediately prescribed rest and a change of scenery, ordering his transport back to the main palace of Versailles. This fatal miscalculation allowed the pathogen to establish a catastrophic foothold. The brick-shaped virions had already infiltrated his respiratory tract, silently overriding his immune system's initial defenses, and were now replicating exponentially within his lymph nodes. From there, the virus flooded his bloodstream in a massive secondary viremia, setting the stage for a biological siege that would mirror the exact horrors his daughter had endured, but amplified by the frailty of his advanced age. The king was no longer the virile, handsome monarch known as Louis the Well-Beloved. He was an exhausted, unpopular ruler, and his body was about to become the most terrifying spectacle in all of Europe. By the 2nd day of May, the insidious nature of the disease could no longer be masked by the deliberate ignorance of the royal medical staff. The king's temperature spiked to lethal levels. His pulse became a frantic, irregular hammer against his wrists, and an agonizing pain settled into his lower back, the classic, dreaded prodromal symptom of severe smallpox infection. Then the eruptions began. At first they were small, angry red macules appearing on his forehead and the back of his hands. Within hours, these spots evolved into raised, hard papules, spreading with terrifying speed down his neck, across his chest, and eventually covering every square inch of his body. The court, previously bustling with sycophants and ambitious nobles, suddenly froze in a state of collective, paralyzing terror. The whispers spread faster than the infection itself. The king had the pox. The absolute ruler of France was officially diagnosed with the very plague that had decimated generations of his own family. ensuring that the exact same horrific sequence of physical liquefaction that had destroyed Princess Henriette decades earlier would now systematically dismantle her father. A frantic scramble for survival immediately consumed the courtiers, leaving the infected monarch entirely abandoned to his fate. Courtiers began to invent excuses to flee the palace, abandoning their heavily fought-over positions in the royal bedchamber. The magnificent halls of Versailles, usually echoing with laughter and the rustle of silk, fell into a suffocating, terrified silence, thick with the smell of burning vinegar and incense, vainly deployed to ward off the invisible miasma. The medical intervention that followed was a grim, mechanical repetition. 22 years later, the royal physicians rigidly deployed the exact same fatal lancets that had drained his daughter. By forcefully extracting his blood during a systemic viral invasion, the physicians only accelerated his physical deterioration. As the first week of May progressed, the disease mutated into an even more lethal variant, hemorrhagic smallpox, known as the Black Pox. The pustules covering his face and body did not simply fill with the usual opaque yellow pus. Because of the severe damage to the endothelial cells lining his blood vessels, massive subcutaneous hemorrhaging occurred. The blisters filled with thick black deoxygenated blood, fusing together into massive necrotic plates. His face, once the subject of countless flattering portraits and the absolute center of the French political universe, swelled into a grotesque, unrecognizable blackened mass. His throat and respiratory tract were equally ravaged by the lesions, making every breath a ragged, gurgling struggle, and preventing him from swallowing even a drop of water. The man who had commanded armies and built architectural marvels was reduced to a moaning, bleeding entity, completely dependent on the very few attendants brave enough to withstand the environment. The stench emanating from the royal bedchamber became legendary in its sheer offensive power. It was the undeniable smell of a human being actively rotting while still breathing, a putrid, sweet and sour odor of necrotizing tissue that completely overpowered the heavy perfumes of the palace. The biological reality of the virus had stripped away every illusion of majesty, leaving behind nothing but an agonizingly slow, humiliated death. The psychological terror within the palace mirrored the biological devastation of the king. The entire political machinery of France ground to a complete halt, suspended in a macabre vigil outside the contaminated bedchamber. At the far end of the palace, isolated from the infection zone, the young Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, and his wife Marie Antoinette waited in terrified anticipation. They knew that the moment the candle in the king's window was snuffed out, the prearranged signal of his death, the immense crushing weight of a financially ruined and politically unstable kingdom would crash down upon their young shoulders. Meanwhile, the king was forced to confront the spiritual consequences of his life. Realizing his imminent demise, he dismissed Madame du Barry, sending his beloved mistress away into exile so that he could receive the last rites. The ultimate symbol of earthly power was forced to publicly confess his sins, his voice a barely audible bubbling whisper through a throat lined with bleeding ulcers. The church, which had so often turned a blind eye to his excesses, now stood over his decomposing body, extracting a final humiliating repentance. His final hours were defined by both unbearable physical agony and a suffocating spiritual isolation, surrounded only by priests administering to a soul while physically recoiling from the corrupted flesh that housed it. On the afternoon of May 10th, 1774, the agonizing struggle finally ceased. The blackened, festering mass that had once been the absolute monarch of France drew its final rattling breath. The moment the king died, the great exodus of Versailles began in earnest. The courtiers did not walk, they ran. A deafening roar of footsteps echoed through the Galerie de Glace as the nobility scrambled over each other to escape the infected zone and rush to the apartments of the new king, Louis XVI, leaving the corpse of the well-beloved entirely abandoned. There was no grand lying in state. There was no public mourning. The fear of the contagion and the sheer unbearable foulness of the corpse dictated a response rooted purely in biological hazard management. The body was so severely decomposed, the flesh so liquefied by the hemorrhagic pox, that the attendants could barely lift him without the tissue separating from the bone. They hurriedly doused the remains in spirits of wine, wrapped him in heavy linen sheets, and violently forced him into a double-lead coffin. Plumbers were rushed in, their faces covered with vinegar-soaked cloths, to quickly solder the heavy lead seams shut, trapping the horrific stench and the billions of infectious virions inside. The final journey of Louis XV was the ultimate testament to the absolute failure of his reign and the ruthless leveling power of disease. Unlike the majestic grand processions that usually accompanied a French king to his final resting place, the funeral cortege of Louis XV was conducted in the dead of night, shrouded in secrecy and profound embarrassment. A small, hastily assembled carriage carried the sealed lead box out of the gates of Versailles, accompanied only by a handful of guards and attendants. As the carriage rumbled along the dark road toward the Basilica of Saint-Denis, it did not encounter grieving subjects lining the streets. Instead, it was met with the jeers, curses, and mocking laughter of the Parisian populace. The people of France, bankrupted by his wars and starved by his economic mismanagement, openly celebrated the death of the monarch. They shouted insults at the heavy wagon, completely ignorant of the fact that the rotting biological matter sealed within the lead was exacting a far more brutal punishment on the king than any angry mob ever could. He was hurriedly lowered into the royal crypt, placed in the freezing darkness near the very daughter he had abandoned to the same horrific fate 22 years earlier. The man who had thought himself untouchable was ultimately consumed by the same microscopic predator, his absolute power entirely useless against the relentless, blind mechanics of cellular destruction. Yet, as the heavy stone slabs of Saint-Denis were sealed over his lead coffin, the true horror of the French monarchy's physical legacy was only just beginning. The virus had done its work, rotting the crow. DUN from the inside out, but the final catastrophic destruction of the royal bodies, the ultimate desecration of the flesh, would not come from a pathogen, but from the sharp falling blade of political vengeance, a mechanical invention that would soon reduce the concept of divine immunity to a severed, bleeding head rolling in the sawdust. The terrifying biological reality that had literally liquefied Princess Anne Henriette and subsequently reduced the absolute monarch, King Louis XV, to a festering, sealed biological hazard did not simply vanish with their hasty nocturnal burials. The microscopic pathogen had completed its devastating work on their physical forms, but a different, equally virulent contagion had already taken root deep within the structural foundations of the Bourbon monarchy. When the 20-year-old Louis XVI and his 19-year-old queen, Marie Antoinette, fell to their knees in sheer terror upon hearing of the old king's death in May 1774, They inherited far more than a crown. They took control of a terminal patient. The French state was completely bankrupt, exhausted by decades of frivolous royal expenditure and disastrous foreign wars. The peasantry, making up the vast majority of the population, was starving, heavily taxed, and utterly disenfranchised. The young royal couple, completely insulated within the gilded, sanitized bubble of Versailles, remained tragically oblivious to the immense pressure building outside their gates. They attempted to scrub away the stench of the previous reign with fresh paint, new fabrics, and endless distracting entertainments, falsely believing that the rot had been buried alongside the lead coffins in the Basilica of Saint-Denis. They failed to understand that the absolute divine right of kings, a concept that had historically shielded them from accountability, had been fundamentally shattered the moment the public realized that a monarch could rot, bleed, and scream in agony just like any commoner in the gutters of Paris. For 15 years, the new king and queen performed a desperate, elaborate pantomime of absolute power, while the structural integrity of their nation collapsed beneath their feet. The political and economic fever of France rose to a critical, unsustainable temperature, just as the humoral physicians had blindly relied on the lancet to bleed out a viral infection. The royal administration relied on brutal taxation and violent suppression to cure a starving populace. The inevitable result was massive systemic shock. In 1789, the body politic finally ruptured. The French Revolution erupted far beyond a simple political disagreement. It manifested as a violent, uncontrollable immune response against a parasitic elite. The starving masses of Paris, driven by centuries of accumulated humiliation and raw physical hunger, violently dismantled the Bastille, effectively severing the head of absolute royal authority. The revolution rapidly mutated from a demand for constitutional reform into a radical bloodthirsty purge. The sanitized, heavily perfumed halls of Versailles were breached by thousands of furious citizens, forcing the royal family to abandon their isolated sanctuary and face the brutal, filthy reality of the capital. The illusion of divine protection was stripped away entirely, leaving the monarchy exposed to a mechanical, highly efficient form of destruction that required no microscopic pathogen to execute its lethal mandate. The shift from the biological terror of the variola virus to the mechanized terror of the Republic was finalized in the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine, an instrument of execution explicitly designed by enlightened physicians to be purely egalitarian and efficiently lethal, replaced the unpredictable horror of disease. It was a machine that cared nothing for the balance of bodily humors or the sanctity of royal blood. It operated on sheer physics, the precise application of gravity, mass, and a sharply angled BO, aid to instantly sever the spinal cord and the massive jugular veins. In January 1793, Louis XVI was strapped to the wooden plank and decapitated in front of a roaring crowd. Months later, Marie Antoinette met the exact same fate, her blood pooling in the sawdust alongside common thieves and political dissidents. The physical eradication of the living monarchs, however, was not enough to satiate the psychological fury of the radical Jacobins. The new republic demanded a total, uncompromising purification of the French soil. They recognized that the ideological power of the Bourbon dynasty did not solely reside in the living king, but was deeply anchored in the physical remains of his ancestors. To permanently destroy the myth of royal supremacy, they had to destroy the physical evidence of its history, a ruthless physical reckoning that would soon violently disturb the forgotten rotting remains of Princess Henriette in the freezing darkness. On August 1st, 1793, Bertrand Barrère, speaking before the National Convention, proposed a decree of breathtaking historical violence. To celebrate the upcoming first anniversary of the storming of the Tuileries Palace and the official fall of the monarchy, he demanded the total destruction of the royal necropolis at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. This magnificent Gothic cathedral, located just north of Paris, had served as the sacred resting place for nearly every French sovereign since the 6th century. It was a vast, silent archive of absolute power, filled with soaring stained glass, intricate marble effigies, and deep freezing crypts holding the remains of over 100 kings, queens, princes, and princesses. Barrère argued that the Republic could not truly claim victory while the corpses of tyrants still occupied monumental tombs paid for by the blood and sweat of the people. The convention unanimously passed the decree. The systematic state-sponsored desecration of a millennium of history was scheduled to begin immediately. Beyond simply looting the tombs for valuable metals to fund the Revolutionary Army, their ultimate objective was executing a profound, irreversible act of historical erasure. They intended to drag the divine right of kings out of the darkness, expose it to the harsh light of a new era, and physically grind it into dust. The logistics of this unprecedented exhumation were handed over to a combination of revolutionary officials, municipal workers, and a massive, enthusiastic mob armed with heavy sledgehammers, iron crowbars, and chisels. Watching this organized destruction with quiet, helpless horror was Dom Germain Poirier, a Benedictine monk and archivist deeply devoted to the history of the abbey. He was forced by the revolutionary authorities to act as the official record keeper of the desecration, standing by as centuries of painstakingly preserved heritage were violently disassembled. In mid-October 1793, the violent clashing of iron against marble echoed through the sacred nave of the basilica. The workers first targeted the magnificent sculpted effigies above ground, smashing the stone faces of sleeping monarchs and dragging the heavy bronze monuments out the massive wooden doors to be melted down into cannons. Once the protective architecture was obliterated, the mob descended into the freezing, oppressive darkness of the Bourbon crypt. This was the most heavily fortified section of the necropolis, a grim subterranean vault where the lead coffins of the most recent royal generations had been stacked upon iron trestles. It was here that the workers came face to face with the horrific physical legacy of the diseases that had ravaged the royal family. The extraction of King Louis XV was an exercise in pure physiological revulsion. When the workers hauled the heavy, double-sealed lead coffin of the well-beloved out of the crypt, the sheer weight and the bloated, warped shape of the metal casing hinted at the nightmare contained within. Despite having been buried for nearly 2 decades, the anaerobic environment inside the soldered lead had prevented the natural, clean skeletalization of the remains. Instead, it had fostered a foul, stagnant putrefaction. When the workers drove heavy iron spikes through the lead to pry the lid open, an explosive release of trapped, highly toxic cadaveric gas rushed into the faces of the mob. The stench was so catastrophically overwhelming, a concentrated miasma of rotted flesh and dried hemorrhagic blood, that the hardened revolutionary workers instantly dropped their tools, vomiting violently and scrambling back toward the stairwell to escape the suffocating odor. Dom Poirier meticulously recorded that the king's remains were not a skeleton, but a massive, unrecognizable, liquefied black mass of putrid organic matter. To neutralize the overpowering biological hazard, the Revolutionary Guards were forced to burn huge quantities of gunpowder and vinegar within the crypt just to make the air breathable enough to continue their work. The absolute monarch, the man who had terrified Europe, was now nothing more than a highly offensive obstacle to his own destruction. Just a few paces away lay the coffin of Princess Anne Henriette, the radiant beauty who had been tortured to death by the humoral physicians 41 years prior. The mob, driven by a vindictive, leveling fury, showed no hesitation. They dragged her heavy lead container from its resting place and violently pried it open. The sight that greeted them was a stark, brutal confirmation of the extreme physical degradation she had suffered in her final days. The virus and the unsterilized lancets had thoroughly destroyed her cellular structure before she had even taken her last breath, leaving behind a gelatinous, foul-smelling residue of ruined tissue clinging to stained, brittle bones. The crowd did not see a tragically deceased young woman. They saw only the despised, rotting refuse of a tyrannical bloodline. They grabbed the fragile remains with crude iron tongs and bare hands, tearing apart the skeleton. The bones that had once commanded the strings of a viola with unmatched grace were snapped and violently thrown into wooden wheelbarrows alongside the remains of her siblings, her parents, and the blackened liquid mass of her father, Louis XV. The violent mingling of these royal remains completely stripped away all individual identity, reducing centuries of carefully cultivated lineage to a chaotic, anonymous pile of highly infectious biological debris. The final destination for this royal refuse was located just outside the walls of the basilica, in a cemetery formerly reserved for the monks of the abbey. The revolutionary authorities had ordered the excavation of two massive, deep communal trenches. These massive trenches served a far darker purpose than mere graves, functioning purely as designated destruction zones. The wheelbarrows, overflowing with the shattered bones, putrid flesh, and mummified remains of the Bourbon dynasty, were unceremoniously tipped over the edge, sending the royal corpses tumbling down into the dirt. To ensure that these remains could never be recovered, venerated, or used as political relics by royalist sympathizers, the Republic employed a brutally efficient chemical method of erasure. Thick, heavy layers of quicklime were shoveled directly on top of the tangled mass of bodies. Quicklime, or calcium oxide, is a highly reactive caustic alkaline substance. When it came into contact with the residual moisture of the corpses, the damp earth, and the subsequent layers of soil thrown over it, an intense, violent exothermic reaction occurred. The temperature within the pit spiked drastically, literally boiling the remaining soft tissue and rapidly dissolving the calcium matrices of the bones. The crowd stood at the edge of the pit, watching as the earth hissed and steamed, an acrid white smoke rising into the cold October air. They were witnessing the literal chemical dissolution of the divine right of kings. The quicklime spared nothing. It burned through the blackened rot of Louis XV and aggressively consumed the shattered fragments of Princess Anne Henriette. It leveled the exalted and the diseased, the beautiful and the grotesque, into a singular, homogeneous white paste beneath the soil of France. This chemical annihilation was the ultimate counter-narrative to the grand, orchestrated illusions of Versailles. the absolute power that had demanded the relentless bloodletting of a dying princess that had believed itself entirely insulated from the consequences of its own ignorance, was finally and permanently eradicated. The brutal intersection of biological disease, medical torture, and revolutionary vengeance had reached its absolute conclusion. There were no longer any monarchs resting in Saint Denis. There was only scorched earth and the lingering bitter scent of calcium hydroxide. Yet even as the smoke cleared over the mass graves and the Republic declared a total victory over the past, the brutal mechanics of human nature and the insatiable hunger for absolute power were already beginning to forge a new empire from the ashes, ensuring that the heavy iron cycle of human suffering was far from over. When the intense boiling heat of the quicklime reaction finally subsided beneath the cold, damp soil of the monks' cemetery, a profound and eerie silence descended upon the Basilica of Saint-Denis. The heavy autumn rains of 1793 began to fall, seeping deep into the disturbed earth and interacting with the residual calcium oxide. This natural hydration finalized the brutal chemical breakdown of the Bourbon dynasty. The highly alkaline environment ruthlessly dissolved the remaining calcium phosphate matrices of the royal skeletons. The bones of Princess Anne Henriette, which had already been degraded by the necrotic ravages of confluent smallpox and the violent shattering of the revolutionary mob, lost all structural integrity. They collapsed into a dense, featureless white paste, inextricably fused with the liquefied, blackened remains of King Louis XV and the shattered fragments of dozens of other monarchs. Beneath the surface of the earth, the rigid, centuries-old hierarchy of the French court was utterly eradicated. There was no longer a king, a princess, or a queen. There was only a chemically homogeneous stratum of altered topsoil. Above ground, the basilica itself stood entirely hollowed out. Stripped of its lead roofing to manufacture musket balls and emptied of its bronze effigies to forge artillery, the towering Gothic structure ceased to be a sacred necropolis. It was repurposed by the Republic as a mere storage depot for grain and military supplies. The physical space had been violently severed from its historical anchors, leaving behind a monumental architectural corpse that echoed only with the sounds of marching boots and the grinding of wagon wheels. A royal corpse was dumped mercilessly into a cold, muddy pit, scorched and entirely disintegrated by boiling layers of quicklime, cursed as a symbol of parasitism and tyranny. She was buried by the very citizens who once bowed to her, shoveling filthy dirt to permanently erase her from history. Yet this was the exact same woman who once reigned at the pinnacle of glory in the most magnificent court of Europe, whose every breath was meticulously monitored by dozens of the highest-ranking royal physicians, and whose silk-draped bed was the absolute center of power for the entire French Empire. She was Princess Anne Henriette of the House of Bourbon. Why did the absolute zenith of royal majesty have to be crushed into nameless dust, liquefying in sheer agony, before humanity could awaken and discover the truth about the disease that slaughtered her? Even as the physical remains of the monarchy were being pulverized into the earth, a parallel and equally brutal revolution erupted within the medical institutions of Paris, dealing a fatal blow to the very humoral system that had killed Henriette. The collapse of her family's dynasty and the massive casualties of the Reign of Terror created an unprecedented surplus of human corpses. The dogmatic authority of the humoral physicians, the exact men who had confidently wielded the lancet, bleeding Henriette dry under the delusion of balancing her fluids according to the unquestionable texts of Galen, was shattered by the Republic. Hospitals like the Hôtel Dieu and the Charité transformed from religious hospices into vast clinical laboratories. A new hardened generation of anatomists, such as Marie-François Xavier Bichat, discarded the lancet and picked up the scalpel. If these ruthless empiricists who sawed through the rib cages of thousands of impoverished corpses had stood beside Henriette's bed in the winter of 1752, they would not have wasted time muttering about corrupted blood or invisible miasmas. Armed with a new tissue-based pathology, they would have instantly recognized that the variola virus was viciously tearing apart and destroying the epidermal and dermal layers of the princess. They would have seen that her plummeting blood pressure was not a symptom of excess heat, but the direct mechanical consequence of massive fluid loss through those ruined tissues. The clinical revolution in Paris, built upon the corpses of the very citizens who overthrew Henriette's family, proved with devastating empirical certainty that the medical protocols inflicted upon her had been nothing more than legalized butchery. The historical irony surrounding Henriette grew even more bitter as the political landscape of France was devoured by Napoleon Bonaparte. When this artillery officer crowned himself emperor in 1804, he attempted to recreate the grandeur of Versailles. Yet his court was deliberately scoured clean of the rotting bloodlines of the past. Napoleon entered the Basilica of Saint-Denis in 1806 and was struck by its humiliating emptying. SS. Despite ordering the restoration of the crypts and the installation of new stained glass, he could not manufacture royal corpses to fill the echoing voids. The empty tombs of Henriette and her father, Louis XV, stood as a harsh testament that Napoleon's modern empire, forged by grapeshot and willpower, was the absolute antithesis of the biological fragility and medical ignorance that had sealed the doom of the old regime. When Napoleon's empire collapsed and King Louis XVIII was restored to the throne in 1815, bearing immense psychological trauma, his first mandate was to physically reconnect with history by excavating the royal bones. In January 1817, teams of laborers armed with pickaxes tore into the hardened earth of the Saint-Denis cemetery, desperately searching for any identifying mark, a royal seal, or the intact skull of Henriette. But the earth had digested her with ruthless efficiency. They found no intact skeletons. The white-gray stratum they struck was the absolute chemical aftermath of quicklime. Henriette, who had died a terrifying, liquefied death under the unsterilized blades of supreme arrogance, was ultimately flattened into indistinguishable atomic matter. Her royal flesh was just as susceptible to putrefaction, dissolution, and chemical eradication as the carcass of a stray dog. The workers had no choice but to shovel that anonymous mud into massive black marble ossuaries, sealing them deep within the crypt. She was mixed for eternity with the father who had been too cowardly to comfort her on her deathbed, and with the dust of the revolutionary mob that had despised her. The variola virus had stripped away her beauty, the humoral physicians had drained her life, and the Republic had dissolved her bones, completing the absolute anonymization of absolute power. This horrific reality fundamentally fractured the intellectual foundations of the old world, proving that if the king's body was not sacred, and if their greatest academic physicians were lethally wrong, then the entire structure of the ancient regime was a deadly, gilded illusion. This physical anonymization of Henriette paved the way for the mathematical condemnation of her murderers. The final collapse of humoral theory did not stem from philosophical debates, but from the cold numbers compiled by physician Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis in the 1820s. Using the numerical method on hundreds of fever patients, Louis proved with terrifying mathematical precision that aggressive bloodletting significantly increased the mortality rate. Had this method been retroactively applied to the winter of 1752, the data would have clearly indicated that the royal physicians were actively murdering the Princess of France. As the virus destroyed Henriette's skin barrier, fluids, electrolytes, and plasma proteins wept uncontrollably, causing a severe drop in intravascular oncotic pressure and devastating third spacing, the reason her face swelled until she was blinded. While her circulatory system fought desperately to maintain blood pressure against severe hypovolemia, the physicians drove their lancets into her veins, draining pint after pint. They stripped away her last remaining red blood cells, completely neutralizing her oxygen-carrying capacity, and pushed her directly into fatal hemorrhagic shock, mechanically shutting down her organs. The once glorious lancet was unmasked as one of the most prolific weapons of mass murder in medical history. Even with the lancet discarded, humanity had to wait until the dawn of microbiology in the late 19th century to truly see the invisible phantom that had consumed Henriette's life. If those arrogant physicians standing around her bed had possessed the electron microscopes of Pasteur or Koch, they would have been forced to look the true enemy in the eye, the variola major virus. That massive brick-shaped virion, armored with a double membrane and a tight DNA genome, operated inside Henriette with terrifying mechani. Cow precision. It invaded her macrophages, hijacked her cellular machinery to replicate, and secreted proteins designed to blind her immune system. These biological machines cared nothing for divine right or royal bloodlines. The sheer horror of confluent smallpox, which turned the radiant Madame Seconde into a rotting gelatinous mass, was merely the macroscopic result of billions of these microscopic entities tearing apart her royal flesh cell by cell, entirely immune to the ridiculous academic theories of Versailles. The pride of the dynasty was defeated not by foreign armies, but by the genetic code of a brainless parasite. Place the sterile, gleaming white laboratories of the modern World Health Organization, where scientists in high-pressure biohazard suits carefully guard the last frozen vials of variola major, right next to the filthy, blood-soaked bed sheets of an 18th century Versailles bedchamber, where Henriette is dying, methodically bled dry by arrogant men in powdered wigs. The bridge between these two rooms is Edward Jenner's method of vaccination, which used the body's own cellular memory to build an impenetrable biological shield, permanently denying the virus access to the human host. The campaign to eradicate smallpox, concluding in Somalia in 1977, stands as the greatest triumph of empirical science. Yet, behind that brilliant halo, the world conveniently forgets a brutal truth. Princess Anne Henriette, like millions of nameless commoners who perished alongside her, was a mandatory sacrificial victim in the agonizingly slow, blind, and bloody evolution of human knowledge. The tragedy of her horrific death is magnified infinitely when viewed through the cold lens of modern medicine, exposing the cruel reality that her supreme agony was not fate or divine punishment, but a completely preventable catastrophe triggered by the lethal intersection of a ruthless virus and the supreme arrogance of an ignorant medical elite. Yet despite this ultimate scientific triumph, modern society exhibits a profound, almost deliberate amnesia regarding the visceral, horrific realities of its own history. Today, millions of tourists flock to the Palace of Versailles every year. They walk through the Hall of Mirrors, they admire the manicured geometric precision of the gardens, and they stare in awe at the intricate gilded woodwork of the king's grand apartments. They consume the carefully curated, sanitized myth of the Bourbon dynasty. They see the dazzling portraits of Princess Anne Henriette, forever young, forever beautiful, holding her viola with delicate, aristocratic grace. But the physical space has been entirely scrubbed of its traumatic biological truth. The tourists do not smell the suffocating sweet and sour stench of necrotizing flesh that once saturated those heavy velvet drapes. They do not hear the desperate rattling gasps of a young woman drowning in her own infected fluids. They do not see the massive pools of dark, uncoagulated blood drained onto the polished oak floors by men who believed they were executing the pinnacle of medical science. Heritage tourism demands beauty, tragedy, and romance. It violently rejects the grotesque, the putrid, and the medically humiliating. By choosing to remember only the porcelain skin and the silk gowns, we commit a secondary, entirely modern form of damnatio memoriae. We erase the agonizing physical reality of their suffering, and in doing so, we forget the most crucial lesson their horrifying deaths provided: the liquefying death of Princess Anne Henriette, the festering demise of King Louis XV, and the ultimate chemical annihilation of their bones beneath the quicklime of the Revolution stand together as a colossal, unavoidable testament to the absolute fragility of the human condition. The grandest illusions of power, wealth, and divine right are ultimately powerless when confronted by the cold, mechanical realities of cellular biology and empirical physics. The crow, Nickel of the French royal court, transcends the mere political collapse of a regime, standing instead as a profound medical horror story about the terrifying consequences of intellectual arrogance. Far from being evil men, acting with malicious intent, the physicians who tortured Henriette were highly educated, fiercely dedicated professionals who were completely, fatally trapped within a flawed paradigm, unable to see the destruction they were causing because their dogmatic theories blinded them to the empirical evidence screaming from the dying flesh of their patient. This is the ultimate chilling legacy of the beauty that was destroyed at Versailles. It forces us to look in the mirror and question the absolute certainties of our own era. It demands that we recognize the incredibly thin, fragile membrane that separates health from putrefaction and civilization from barbaric medical ignorance. The bones of the Bourbons may be dissolved into an anonymous gray paste in the crypts of Saint Denis, but the horrific narrative of their biological collapse remains entirely intact. Princess Anne Henriette did not survive to inherit a kingdom, nor did she find peace in the afterlife she was promised. Instead, her agonizing descent from a radiant goddess of art to a sealed biological hazard serves as humanity's most brutal, unyielding reminder. In the absolute final reckoning of existence, the virus does not bow to the crown, the flesh always rots, and the only true defense we possess against the terrifying darkness of the natural world is the relentless, unforgiving light of empirical truth.